Okay, good evening. Welcome everybody to tonight's Royal Conservatoire of Scotland Exchange Talk. Thank you so much for joining us. My name's Laura Bissell and I'm the interim head of the Contemporary Performance Practice programme. And I'm also lecturer in research at the RCS. So I'm really delighted to welcome you to the exchange talk this evening by Ashanti Harris and Sabrina Henry. So before we begin, tonight's BSL interpreter is Yvonne Strain, and her video will be visible on the right-hand side of the screen. So you can scale that up by hovering over the video and using the arrow. If you require closed captioning, the link is in the chat just now with details. And the closed captioner tonight is Elise Murray. So tonight we will have the talk and then a Q&A session that will last around 15 minutes. So if you would like to ask a question, I would encourage you to pop it in the Q&A box, which you can find at the bottom of the screen. And you can upvote any questions that you would really like answered, and I'll do my best to get to them. Now, I would encourage you to pop your questions in nice and early if you have them, as sometimes people leave it till right at the end and then we don't have time. So for the duration of the webinar, as participants, your cameras and mics will be off. If you do want to tweet about tonight's event, you can do so at RCS_the exchange. So also in the chat, the next this term's exchange talk, can be found in a link that's going to be popped up in the chat in a moment. Thank you. So without further ado, I will introduce our talk this evening. So the Reaction of Black Performance is a British art network research group led by Sabrina Henry, who is assistant curator at the CCA in Glasgow, and Ashanti Harris, lecturer in contemporary performance at the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland and one part of Project X. So this talk will explore how the state of being reactive is used as a theme in Black British performance art, not only as an act of agency and resistance, but additionally as a creative catalyst in the form, process, intention, and legacy of the works created. So in this exchange talk, Ashanti and Sabrina will present their individual creative research practices as a catalyst to open up conversation around the themes of the research group. So without any further ado, I will pass over to Ashanti.
Thanks, Laura. I will just begin sharing. Okay, thank you. Hi, everybody. This is very strange not being able to see anyone, but it is nice to feel your energies here today. So in starting to organize this talk today, I was kind of going through my practice, my art practice, and finding it really difficult to write the talk, because one thing that I've learned from my practice is that the moving body makes meaning through experience. And so a problem presents itself in the translation of this physical bodily knowledge into writing. Writing cannot be a direct sharing of the acquired knowledge, but only ever a communication of an experience. Embracing this today, mine and Sabrina's presentations are something between a curated stream of consciousness and a recounting of experiences which are all infinitely bound with movement and action. These presentations are not conclusive. They are where we are starting from. They are a map of where we have been. They are an introduction. They are a provocation, and they are a call we will follow on our journey to comprehend the response, which we know is already there waiting. I am an artist and researcher, exploring themes of identity and diaspora through a multidisciplinary practice. I originally trained in sculpture, and I feel most comfortable when engaging with materials and solving material problems through physical processes. Alongside this, I'm drawn to the expanded ways an artwork can be experienced, and this has led me to work with performance, movement, and dance as elements within my multidisciplinary arts practice, as movement and dance are forms which I consider to be historically embodied, contextual, and interconnected areas of lived experience. I also apply this thinking to working with sculptural materials and processes, focusing on traditional craft and fabrication practices which embody cultures, ancestral legacies, and human lived experience. I worked with craft and sculptural processes as a performative research method, physically embodying these histories, cultures, and legacies through the act of making. Alongside my individual art practice, I'm 1/3 of the collective Glasgow Open Dance School, or GODS, a collective facilitating experimental movement research with a focus on dance as the experience of movement rather than the performance of movement. For GODS, movement begins with the body. To de-intellectualize by listening acutely to the body, the collective body, and my individual body. Following feeling rather than style or technique, we move from the gut, learning together, allowing our instinct to be our nose, leading us toward what is attractive to us and away from what is not. It is integral that GODS is physical and holistic, valuing shared learning and collective movement above individual excellence. We, you, move as a group in continual process, without pressure to perform or finalize. My relationship to dance is as an untrained dancer, engaging with dance as a process of understanding myself, my identity, and my connection to the world. As a child growing up, my parents sent me to classes in Afro-Caribbean contemporary dance as a way to teach me about my heritage. Born in Guyana and moving to the UK when I was very young, my experiences of the Caribbean were predominantly through the people around me who embodied this heritage and transformed it to me through stories, food, music, and dance. The kinesthetic portfolio refers to the movement experiences held within the body. The term kinesthesia refers to an individual's process of learning new abilities through the body, through defining a repertoire of possibilities of what I can do, fortified by a sense of agency. It's already there waiting to be activated, to become the reaction. Dance for me is first and foremost an embodied practice. It is history and memories archived within the body and accessed physically from person to person through direct encounters between individuals. When I dance Akpi, a traditional dance I learned in the Volta region of Ghana, or Duplé technique, a codified contemporary African dance developed by Alphonse Thierroux and taught to me by a Glasgow-based choreographer, Eric Maurizio Valentine, I am embodying these histories and their associated narratives, passed from person to person and ending with me. When I dance these dances, I am mapping my relationship to them in my body, my own diasporic narrative in movement, with all its comforts and discomforts and familiarities and unfamiliarities, all of the ways that something just doesn't feel right, and all the times I have felt born to move this way. When I share my own movement, I'm sharing my history. In 2017, I co-founded Project X with my collaborators Melly Brooms and Rhea Lewis. Project X is an organization which platforms and champions dance from the African and Caribbean diaspora in Scotland. We produce community productions as well as professional productions, and we collaborate with artists from across the diaspora. For Project X, movement is knowledge. It is our connection to a history and heritage that is far away from us, and a celebration of every individual movement story which has been written from it. Through dancing, we are empowered with historical knowledge of African and Caribbean culture and its contemporary impact in every context we move in. These are some images of some Project X performances. This is one called Ghost Dimensions. Yeah, there you go, Ghost Dimensions. I often find answers in this quote by Rosina Bonsu, a dancer and choreographer whose support and continuous wisdom has guided me over the past decade. When talking to me in an interview about dance from the African and Caribbean diaspora in Scotland, Rosina said, "Dance is an incredibly powerful tool for accessing human potential. It has the power to be transformative. It gives people a window into themselves. It builds resilience, perseverance. It builds relationships. It builds ideas of dependence and independence. It builds dialogue, which is crucial. Dance, by its very nature, gets us to touch our skin. It gives people the opportunity to ground themselves. Dance brings parameters together." I repeatedly come back to these words with new understanding after every project or process. Dance has been incorporated into my artistic practice as a means of research through embodied knowledge, exploring the potential of my moving, dancing body. Through my artwork, I aim to disrupt historical narratives and reimagine them from a Caribbean diasporic perspective. My research and practice are guided by a post-colonial methodology. This choice is a personal response to the history of colonialism and its present-day reverberations, which shape a particular relationship between mind and body for colonized people. As an artist working with my own body, the body of a Guyanese British woman with brown skin and a Yorkshire accent, my experiences have made me aware of the ways in which my living, moving, speaking, and dancing body can be read and written upon with expressions of otherness within a discourse which represents Black people as something other than self-constituting subjects. I place my own body within my work, both as a means of embodied knowledge and also as a method of perceiving the parallels of old and new forms of dehumanization, in order to expose and challenge the power structures embedded within conventional European art history. The impetus behind my work, I was going too fast with my slides. The impetus behind my work and research is to carve a space for alternative narratives, to compel both the performers, who are often participators in my work, and also to compel the audience to perform acts of critical and creative reinterpretation and reimagining. Since 2018, I have been working on a body of artistic research, which I have been calling the Forgotten Diaspora Project. These two images are it's a map of British Guyana and a map of Scotland, both made around 1800. The one of Scotland was stitched by Margaret Montgomery in approximately 1800. The Forgotten Diaspora Project is informed by the work of David Alston, a Scottish historian based in Cromarty, whose research looks at the historical relationship between Scotland and Guyana, the country I am from. To give you some background on this historical relationship, as well as some background about Guyana, the Republic of Guyana is a Caribbean country on the coast of South America, bordered by Venezuela, Brazil, and Suriname. Guyana is a former colony of the British Empire and is historically known as the last frontier of British colonial expansion in the West Indies, populated by both enslaved and indentured people who worked the plantations. Scots were prominent among the plantation owners in Guyana, and by the mid-1790s, the European population of these colonies, the colonizers, were predominantly from the Highlands of Scotland. Consequently, this colonial relationship led to the movement of Guyanese people to Scotland in the 18th and 19th centuries. Part of David Alston's research assembles historical records of these Caribbean people of African heritage in Scotland during this time, detailing their journeys, their Scottish connections, and the places in which they worked and resided. Taking these records as a starting point, I began to explore the historical presence and hidden legacies of this forgotten diaspora from my own perspective as a Guyanese woman in Scotland. I began with a series of reenactments, traveling to the places where they were recorded to have been, walking the routes they may have taken, echoing their movement in my own, walking on the shores of the seas which they traveled on, singing Guyanese songs in the buildings which were once their churches, and visiting the graves where they began their journey into the next life. In 2019, this research contributed to a participatory performance work developed with 7 Scotland-based women of African and Caribbean heritage, which was titled Second Sight. The performance and installation of Second Sight dissected the ways in which these histories are present in the day-to-day experiences of each woman participating. The work was created and exhibited in Civic Room Gallery, a mercantile era building in Glasgow city centre, with a complex history and connections with Scottish colonial legacies and the associated subjugation of Black identity. The performance was very much a process of reconfiguring these historical narratives and taking ownership of them from both an individual and a collective and community perspective. We did this with our bodies, inhabiting the space like ghosts, drawing from our individual kinesthetic portfolios, performing our movement narratives with our eyes closed, and finding pain and joy in our bodies. Visitors to the building were forced to navigate themselves around us, making space for our stories to unravel in dance. History haunts the body, flowing through the blood like ghosts. But when your eyes close, your body transforms. It is boundless. When you close your eyes, you can feel, and this is the way that I believe you can look into the future. The diasporic body is a repository of incorporated histories, traversing geographies, borders, cultures, boundaries, and forms. Forming and reforming within the present moment, diasporic movement narratives are ongoing, multi-layered, multi-dimensional, and perpetually in motion, integrating collective and individualized experiences of movement, every action, its archive and legacy. I'm going to hand over to Sabrina. Sabrina, you're on mute.
That is quite standard. I'll start now. Hapticality, the capacity to feel through others, for others to feel through you, for you to feel them feeling you. I wanted to start my presentation with this slide of Art Is by Lorena Grady, as this series of images represents one of the first times I understood there might be a through path or liminal space that could make room for me to explore all the facets of my culture and imagination. The idea that I or a collective we could frame significant moments as art. Histories, philosophies, peoples, movement, music, textures, frequencies. All that had largely otherwise been sidelined as folk, community, alternative, subversive, not culture, not art, and outside the canon. I'm a curator and costume designer focusing on creating space and object making for repatriating knowledge that can aid in creating a rooted sense of identity so we can place ourselves within multiple geographies, landscapes, and communities. In my research practice, this is focused on the performance practices and ritual traditions of the Black diaspora, and understanding how to anchor Blackness within a Western landscape that often appears to assume no connection with anything outside itself. I'm attempting to create spaces that engender sharing and conviviality about Black diasporic cultural and ritual tradition, connecting histories across the Atlantic through multiple geographies and potentially beyond that into ancestral and future spaces. The first time I tried this was in 2017 in a work called A Study in Devotion. The project began with sculptural artist Dominique White. She created a series of wearable pieces inspired by Mamiwata, a Yoruba folk legend relating to water, and we wanted to understand how to open the work up beyond the gallery space. In the end, the project brought together 9 artists as dance ethnographer, choreographers, percussive musician, sculptural artist, and photographer to work together over a period of 2 weeks, exploring a contemporary understanding of traditional African diasporic practices relating to rituals of transition. The performance took place on Peckham High Street in an old meat market that was hosting a year-long program of art events before it became a co-working space. We specifically chose this space because the performance could be viewed directly from the street and crossroads of Row Lane. This became important when thinking about the nature of this kind of work, the idea of ritual spaces being private, but also the conflict of a collective of Black artists in a rapidly gentrifying but predominantly Black area. Holding a performative ritual that was essentially a work of art felt at odds. That it was possible for the public to enter the space, invited or not, whether they observed from the street, top level of the bus, or felt to wander in out of curiosity was important, as a reminder of and way to pay respect to the area and the history of African and Caribbean communities there. Excuse me. This project was also the first time I began to think very specifically about the role of costume in performance, how it could communicate and support the wearer, acting as a supporting character to movement language. I often think about the use of costume in Trajal Haral's work. He had explained that the pieces selected weren't just clothes. They were items chosen as an extension and representation of the story and character. From this, I grew to understand that a costume could be a character in itself. You can project a narrative onto any object and imbue it with meaning to best serve the intentions of the work. And this can be done in multiple layers through multiple people working to greater strength and commitment to the collective intention of a project. These methods and desires are a process and an experiment, and I haven't always been successful in the ways I've worked in them. That said, I've not yet been part of a process that didn't leave me and others changed in their ways of thinking, understanding themselves, or potential for ways of learning and exchanging, which I always think is the richest and most rewarding thing about working in performance, its ability to help us grow. In 2018, Ashanti and I worked together through the CCA and Project X to bring performance artist, researcher, and curator Ana Beatriz Almeida to Glasgow to lead a 4-day movement workshop that explored Yoruba cosmology, philosophy, movement, and song. This was called Ngonku, the moving energy of death. To quote Ana Beatriz, through the use of silence and breathing, the method proposes a deep body state and a sense of connection with ancestral experiences that would otherwise remain dormant during the daily routine of Western communities. This workshop for me represented a catalyst. I was new to Scotland, so the work itself introduced me to a large community of artists of colour in Glasgow. Central to the workshop was a kind of world making, where Ana Beatriz constantly reminded us that the space we entered into centred Yoruba, not Western logic. I felt that this was as liberating as it was challenging for all the participants. At the end of the 4 days, we had all contributed to an incredibly nurturing space where you had the sense that people at points were able to feel each other without words. This idea of a moving energy of death is something I return to. Death is so often understood as the stillness, the end of motion. But in this workshop, we were taught to understand death as part of the process of life. In Bantu Congo cosmology, the depth of night is the exact point of new life. A dialogue with this liminal space is necessary to create the energy for movement, growth, and transition. The Kalunga is Kikongo for the threshold between worlds. It is the line that separates the living and the dead, that we pass through and that passes through us. The Kalunga represents many things. The idea of a lost world of African peoples who jumped overboard during the Middle Passage, as expanded upon by Drexciya and the Sonic Third Space in their album Deep Sea Dwellers. In Brazil, the Kalungas are the descendants of African peoples who escaped slavery. As part of the cosmogram or Dikenga, the Kalunga line forms the through line of all existence. I first came across the Kalunga line reading an essay about Khalil Joseph's film For Until the Quiet Comes, which features movement artist Storyboard Pete reversing his path past the living into the back window of a lowrider that drives into the dark. Kalunga is a central concept of regional Bakongo cosmology, forming part of the Dikenga sign, which marks the crossroads, the tomb, the parting of ways. The Dikenga, when drawn, becomes a template of the Congo altar, a cross within a circle. The vertical axis, the power line, connects God above with the dead below. The horizontal axis, the Kalunga line, marks the watery boundary between the living and the dead. The notion of the Kalunga resonates deeply with me and informs much of my work on what I understand about Black performance as a continuum of rebirth after rebirth, incarnation after incarnation, produced in constant relation and dialogue with its people, its environment, sound material, its pasts and its futures. As noted by Todd Ramon Ochoa, without Kalunga, there can be no relation. I think often about what it means to claim a cultural heritage I feel geographically distant from, to gather fragments of understanding and be led by my intuition towards the most cathartic way to process embodied trauma and knowledge into joy for myself, the performer, and all that I'm in relation with. Never being on the right side of the Atlantic is an unsettled feeling. It's a feeling that produces a certain distance from the settled who locate themselves in a determined history. The meaning of diaspora surely extends to mean that wherever I am who I am. This doesn't change according to geography. So it becomes essential to invoke ancestral knowledges here and pay tribute to the deleted histories of African and Caribbean peoples that are intrinsically connected to the land in Scotland and elsewhere. Since 2019, I've been developing my practice to answer these questions materially, aiming to create intention-filled, handmade costume forms that incorporate history, trauma, melodies, tension, damage, and the joy anyway. I use handcrafting techniques such as macrame weaving, embroidery knitting, wrapping, inspired by this quote. Slow hand stitching in these hard times is vital for personal and intimate healing, for rebuilding destroyed communities, and for telling the histories of land, water, displacement, and still possible futures. It makes sense to start with sound and rhythm. It's a strange process to listen to music over and over for rhythm and syncopation, not to respond through my body, but to formalize on paper as a drum pattern, to weave into the weft threads of fabric, a way of embodying. For this piece, I shredded a jute sack and wrapped the threads around a copper frame, then tied vertical weft threads ready to transfer the drum pattern. By the time I do this percussion notation, it's more of an earworm than a formalized pattern, a beat that I work to using my fingers to space 6/4 time, beads of varying sizes to symbolize the drum, tied with macrame knots according to my feeling of the sound. It's imprecise as memory is. Relation implies that all the humanities are tied together through the common parts of their respective imaginaries. I attach shells to every thread as a ballast, but they also have a sound as they move, a little like bells or the sound of breaking china. I like the idea that the piece can speak back and has its own audio. During the summer of last year, artist, researcher, and curator Alberta Whittle invited me to contribute costumes to her film Reset. Thinking through the vast and inspiring body of work that represents Alberta's practice and that of choreographer Melly Brooms was performing in the film was an incredible opportunity after so much isolation to understand how this costume could be activated and respond to the body of a performer and the visual narrative of a film work. For reset, I cast the piece in kaolin clay to give it a rigid form that could be softened as reactivated from its petrified state. Through movement, the clay disintegrates, a dust vapor breathes from the piece, shells are lost, beads roll away, and threads become more entangled. The piece lives through wear, but is simultaneously held within the film work in that particular moment through the performer's movement. Thank you.
Thank you both so much for that fascinating talk. I loved hearing that, so thank you. A reminder to our audience that if you have got any questions for Sabrina or Ashanti, to pop them in the Q&A and we will get to them. But I maybe have a couple of questions to start us off, if that would be all right. I was really interested in this idea of craft that you both mentioned. And I was really struck, Sabrina, by the title of that book about craft, Thinking with Care. And I just wonder if maybe you could talk a little bit more about crafting and the way that that connects with both of your practices.
Yeah, Sabrina, do you want to go first, or shall?
No, you can definitely go first. I was too slow to unmute.
Well, I think it's interesting because I think it's in really different ways. Because for me, craft is the way that I became a performer. And I don't want to speak for Sabrina, but in our conversations, it almost feels like Sabrina, you find the performance in your craft. Like I really, in listening to your presentation, I feel so much movement in the way you describe the way that you're working with the materials, and also thinking about how you're translating this drum repetition. It's just, I feel it in my body. I'm kind of like, I'm making this along with you as dance at the same time. For the way that I work with craft, I think it's this idea that you are embodying a heritage or a legacy. Maybe a recent experience of mine is working with traditional lost wax technique to do bronze casting, which was something I'm really drawn to, working with metal as a material because it's got all of these kind of like human qualities. It like heats up, cools down, changes shapes, like reacts and responds to things. But also my name, Ashanti, so I've said in the presentation, I'm Guyanese, I'm from Guyana, but my name is from Ghana. And that's in my name, that's a kind of heritage that's been passed to me from my parents, caring for that Ghanaian heritage. But as a sculptor, I was interested in how, like, working with a history that's so kind of built on sculptural processes and metals and materials, how working with those materials could be a process for me to engage with that history and heritage. And so I started learning about lost wax technique, learning about different metals and their different meanings, also working with things that would have traditionally been cast, like such as Adinkra symbols, which would be embedded into jewelry. And ultimately the knowledge, or the thing that I'm interested in, being that process rather than the thing that I end up with at the end. It's kind of about getting to that point. And I think when I work with performance, it's a really similar way. I like to invite people into that process and thinking about, it's not necessarily about what the final thing is, it's about what we've experienced together. But yeah, I'll hand over to you, Sabrina.
Well, I think that, yeah, what you said at the beginning about kind of the ordering of it makes loads of sense. And I suppose there's another reason why we've connected for the group as well. And hearing how you're speaking about it just I'm sure it was their name is DJ Lenny Denise, and they have a really excellent like South African mixtape, which maybe if you want to know, I'll send it later, but it's very good. But they were talking about ancestral sounds specifically, and just the idea that the drum, the rhythm, the the rhythm of African as a wider continent conversation, but the rhythm of that culture was held within the body when people were moved and put in the hold. Nobody was writing this down, and yet still that knowledge exists now. So I suppose when I'm thinking about craft, I'm thinking of ways, and you were speaking about this in your presentation, about codifying, so that I guess you can't destroy it or lose it or reinterpret it incorrectly. Because if you know how to do it, then I don't see how you could understand it any other way than what it is. So yeah, I suppose somehow it's kind of like making secrets, but secrets for people who already kind of understand what the language is anyway. And it's also just nice to work with my hands, because I spent so long on the computer. So I just think it's a healthier way if I am doing something involved in creativity outside curation, to do it with as little advanced technology as possible, because it's nice. Yeah.
Thank you both for your responses. Did you want to add something, Ashanti?
Oh yeah, I like when you're talking about the way that knowledge travels, and it just brings to mind this like image of like to move or to travel or to be displaced, or like this idea that you can only have what you can carry with you, and what if what you can carry with you is nothing, but that this like internal space is infinite. And like going back to what you said about the rhythm, like those rhythms can be infinite, and then if like the craft processes as well are also hidden in these rhythms, like embedded in the rhythms, then that's kind of, it's something that can always travel and be passed on. There's something really nice about that. I'm really enjoying feeling that.
We've got a couple of questions in, so I'll just read them out. The first one is, will you speak more to the costumes that wore as the performance went on? So yeah, maybe that one's directed specifically at you, Sabrina. But yeah, this idea of costumes wearing as the performance went on.
Yeah, I can just describe it. Hopefully I'll kind of hit on what you're hoping to kind of see or visualize. But I used to work in fashion, and obviously fashion is a very very glamorous and very exciting way of working. But most of the things that are produced within fashion are very particular and very precise. And I suppose when we're thinking about that in terms of what happens to clothes when we get bored of them, they end up in a heap somewhere, and or that can be the case depending on how they're made. So when I'm thinking about costumes and how they're wearing, because I'm trying to think about them as living forms to an extent, or forms that can be made to live through somebody else, then they can't just exist like plastic forever the same. So they have to be able to disintegrate and be remade again. And although I've never worked on a carnival, that is also, as I understand it, the process of carnival making. So those costumes might have existed for 10, 20 years, but they get remade every year, according to different themes that people want to talk about within the community. So you'll always recognize something of a history of the piece, and therefore of the person that wore it, but it can keep changing with time as well. Yeah, because I don't know why. Like why? I don't know. It feels better, I suppose. It feels better that something can live and keep moving and keep regenerating, rather than only exist one time and then you start again. I don't know that we have to think of ourselves that way, as having to always begin again. We're evolving, so I don't know why things can't do the same.
It's really making me think about what you were saying about ideas of rebirth and those sort of cycles. Thank you. We've got another question. So one of our audience says, I resonated with everything you both were talking about, your relationships with movement, costume, dance, and how that embodies your complex identities really struck me, as I am a mixed diasporic individual who is also drawn to movement and materiality in performance. I wondered if you could both talk a bit more about the ideas of exploring and claiming a distant geography and the journey you've gone through in claiming those identities. Ashanti, you want to go first?
Also, just to go back as well. Actually, no, sorry, my thread of thought is gone. No, actually, it's not. About going back to Sabrina talking about the last question with this wearing and things being built over. This is also how this research group started. Like Sabrina and I, for all of these different reasons, like working in performance in different ways and working together and working alongside each other and also attending the things that we're doing and having conversations. And it just felt like these words kept kind of flying around, like, and this like reaction and reactiveness was something that we kept coming back to. And again, it's kind of like this with every new kind of conversation. Sabrina's talking about the carnival costumes and like this like building on something that already exists. And I'm just like, oh yeah, it's like this other thing that we were talking about. And yeah, there is kind of something in like this being this like live conversation where you can allow the sort of fuzzy threads to make themselves known. But yeah, I just wanted to add that on the back of the last the last comment. But this one, talk a bit more about your idea of exploring and claiming a distant geography and the journey you've gone through in claiming those identities. I guess I think that was kind of the, I guess, story that I was trying to tell with my presentation, because I was working through it in time. So Glasgow Open Dance School doesn't necessarily, when I started Glasgow Open Dance School with my two collaborators, it didn't necessarily have anything to do with my identity. It was to do with my experiences of my body and everybody else who was participating's experience of their body. But I think in experiencing my body, that was maybe my first kind of conscious processing of what that was and what I was feeling, and realizing that I could start to process things that I couldn't put words to physically. So that was almost like the first stage of that journey. And the second stage that felt more concrete and tangible was meeting Ria and Melly and starting to have conversations about creating Project X. And Project X, and the difference was, we specifically as three women with diasporic identity, we were having conversations with each other about our experiences. And I think being able to have conversations with people with similar experiences was the first time that collectively we could put things that we were feeling into words. And also, I think the thing with Project X was also a moment of understanding what Sabrina was saying about like what diasporic identity means, is that it's being who I am where I am, and it not necessarily having to relate, like it's so tied and connected to these distant places, but that doesn't, not being there or being far away from there doesn't change who you are and what your experiences are. And actually the important thing is to create a space to hear all of these different experiences and to know that they are all really different, but they are still allowed to be that. And that was something that we had a lot of conversations with. And I think, yeah, again, also like, and also thinking about all of the complexities of a diasporic identity, being a person who's like spent most of their life in the UK, like what that means, or like when all of your family's been in the Caribbean, what your different circumstances are, what privileges you have from being here, and how to find a space to kind of like acknowledge all of those things, without also denying yourself a connection to something that you undoubtedly feel connected to. So I don't even know if this answers the question. It feels like a sort of really long-winded way of saying it's complicated, but maybe actually the crux of what I'm trying to say is it happens through people and through like these communal experience, like communal opportunities to like share experiences, mostly through dancing.
Yeah, it's complicated. It's exactly it, I think, and it's an ongoing journey and process. I mean, as you were talking about gods as well, and kind of, I suppose that as a point of discovery, maybe I think you were saying, but it doesn't really end at all. Yeah, and also the idea of what diasporic identity means, and just the constant kind of conflict and conversation within your own community, and your own community. By that I mean your own Black community and your wider community, i.e. wherever you live, whoever is around you, be they of whatever ethnicity. It requires, I guess a great deal of like self-knowledge to like root yourself in who you are. And even when people will tell you you're not this enough, you're not that enough, you are still, like, I'm still a Black woman. It doesn't matter like how it is perceived. So it's, yeah, I guess constantly trying to understand how I want that to look and how I want that to feel. And just going back to your question, claiming a distant geography, exploring it. I mean, I've never been to where either of my parents are from or born. My dad was born in Manchester, his family from Jamaica. My mum's from St. Kitts, and I've never been there. I think my dad's been to Jamaica once, and my mum hasn't been to St. Kitts. So again, it's like, it's an immaterial understanding of a place that is entirely, for me personally, steeped in kind of fantasy and nostalgia, because I'm just reading about it or hearing about it through family and through what I observe. So I guess it isn't an exploration, which is it's a difficult kind of a tense word to use anyway. You know, there's, maybe we're straying into funny territory, but there's a funny kind of colonialism to exploring your own culture, even when you haven't been there, and kind of trying to reform a culture and identity for yourself elsewhere. I don't know the answers to that either. It's complicated, but it's stuff I think about or worry about while I'm doing all of this. But also there's a lot of richness that comes from it, and through my own explorations and work and reading, I'm able to connect more deeply with my family. So I don't know, ultimately that's a good thing, or it feels a good thing. Yeah.
Thank you both for your responses. And it's so interesting hearing you both speaking, and I was really noticing some of the common like threads or themes in your work. And you mentioned this idea of Ashanti kind of carving a space for an alternative narrative, and Sabrina, you were talking about like costume as narrative. So I was thinking about that as like, as what are these stories? And then you were talking, Ashanti, about action as the archive, and Sabrina, you were talking about this kind of frame as art. So again, I was thinking about what the canon is and how that's created and how that's challenged, and it's really lovely just hearing the different nuances and kind of echoes of these ideas within both of your works. So thank you. It feels very, very rich. We've got another question saying thank you for your presentations. I just had a quick question following along this thread of craft and the ancestry of embodied kinesthetic knowledges. I wonder if you can speak about the simultaneous roles you adopt between learner and teacher within both of your research practices, and how this adoption of both seems to manifest these communities of meaningful mutual exchange. Great question. Anybody like to kick off with a response to that? So there's quite a lot in there, but yeah, the idea of teacher and learner. Yes, who would like to start?
Hang on, I'm just going to take a second to read it through and to, read it again.
I could say a little, but say a little. That's really nice to think about learner-teacher. I suppose when I'm thinking about curation, that's the thing I like about my job, because mostly when you're either tasked with or decide to bring people together to do something, or to invite an artist to produce a piece of work, you're in a learning exchange with them. And even thinking about with Project X, when I first moved to Scotland and understood the work that they did, it was then an opportunity to understand what I could learn from this group of people who had set about creating a community, essentially a community, and then artistic work that could be reciprocal with everybody around them. So for me, it's the most important thing, because I don't think I know enough. So it's nice always to think that there's always more that people will share with you. Yeah, I'm not an expert, and it's nice to think that you can just grow to enrich what you know and keep putting that back in as well. I'll say that.
I kept going back to the question because I wasn't even sure where to approach it from, because I feel like there's so many ways. Yeah, I feel like there's so many ways, but I think what I'm going to talk about is going back to this concept of the call and response that featured a lot in Sabrina and I's initial conversations about starting this research group. And similarly to the cosmogram and this idea of like rebirth after rebirth, we were talking about the undercommons ideas about the call and response, where the call goes out but the response is already there waiting. And I suppose like if the response comes first and the call comes second, I really love that kind of that blurriness of all that kind of like continuous cyclical nature of the fact that both of these things exist simultaneously. And I think it's interesting thinking about that in relation to learning and teaching, and like this idea that, I don't know, like this like searching for knowledge, but the knowledge is already there. Or like this like sharing sharing something when somebody's already there seeking and like shaping the way that they're going to like absorb it and take it. And then also thinking about the like exchanges within that. Again, it's like this kind of fuzzy blurriness that I just keep coming back to in this like cyclical repetitive motion of yeah, or I'm going back to experiences of dancing. I used to dance with a traditional West African dance and percussion ensemble called Ayawaran. And we worked with call and response a lot in performance making. And there is this like really like wonderful moment when the drum creates the call and the dance creates the response, but the drummer is also watching the dancer to follow the dancer's move. And then there's all of a sudden, when you get to this point where you're completely in sync with the musician, it's unclear who is the call, what is the call, and what is the response anymore. And that kind of moment of being in between both of those things is something that I cherish. Kind of, yeah, I think I seek it in collaborations with people. I think that's part of the reason why I like to work with in a sort of participatory experiential way with people, because I think the best things come from that kind of moment of blur where like any kind of hierarchy kind of dissolves and it's all existing there at the same time. And actually, I didn't know that until I said it just now. That was I think that that is nice, because that is the moment when hierarchy dissolves. I had not realized that until this very moment. So thank you, Gordon, for asking that question.
It's really nice to hear you speak about it like that, and the way you say it makes it sound like it speeds up and up and up, so it almost becomes like one rather than two separate entities as well, which is yeah, that also feels quite good.
We're just about out of time, but I just wanted to say, Ashanti, that idea that you're ending on kind of call and response, you know, it was so lovely to see you share Rosina's words, not just the idea that, you know, movement is knowledge, but this idea of dialogue and that kind of idea of dialogue feels so connected to everything you're both speaking about in terms of call and response and this reciprocal kind of cyclical way of working. So yeah, thank you so much. That's been so so rich. We've had a couple of comments, one to say what a stimulating, moving and generally fabulous session it's been. So I just want to say a huge thank you to our audience as well for joining us and for some fantastic questions. Of course, to Sabrina and Ashanti. Also to Yvonne, our interpreter, and Eilish, our captioner. Thank you to the Research Knowledge Exchange team. And just to say that you can follow us on Twitter at RCS_the exchange. And to let you know that the next exchange talk, if you want to join us, will be on Monday, the 1st of February. And the title of that talk is Music, Competition and Tradition, Competitive Piping Repertoire from 1947 to 2015. And that is Andrew Bova. So yes, thank you all once again. That concludes our exchange talk. And we really hope you will join us at the next one. So we will see you all then. Thank you.